Hello, my name is Allison Ban, and I'm the Executive Director of SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk, Reproducibility of 1,000 Articles Lesson Learned with Lars Vilhuber. I'd like to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. Lars Vilhuber holds a Ph.D. in economics from Université de Montréal, Canada, and is currently on the faculty of the Cornell University Economics Department. He has interest in library economics, statistical disclosure limitation, and data dissemination, as well as reproducibility and replicability in the social sciences. He's the editor of the American Economic Association, data editor of the American Economic Association.
Only the data editor.
And managing editor of the Journal of Privacy and Confidentiality. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, definitely not the editor of the journals, but I am the data editor of the 8 journals. I'll get to that. That's where some of these numbers come from. So let me share my screen. Sorry I couldn't be there today. I tried, but it didn't quite work. Just make this smaller. Okay. So this talk is called kind of lessons learned from 1,000 papers, whether it's actually 1,000 or by now 1,500 or 1,200. We'll get to that in some instance. But it has very much to do with data editor hat that I wear at the American Economic Association, but also draws on some conversations with other data editors, for instance, with Marie Connolly at the Canadian Journal of Economics. So this is somewhat a general reflection on where we are. Feel free to interrupt me at any time here. Okay. So if you want to take 3 things away, there's 3 lessons that I'm going to try and get at. One of them is the need for computational empathy on the part of authors. If you've never heard of the idea of computational empathy, I'll explain that in a moment. The second is that there's a need for greater data acumen. That term was defined in a National Academies report in the US for various things I had never encountered before, but I'm using it here, and I will expand on that in a moment. And the third lesson is for the role of institutions. Now, being invited here is already a very good step along the way, but I'll point out where this is not a general phenomenon and where the gaps are to some extent that I see. So let me expand that a bit. The lessons for students and researchers that I'm going to draw from sort of my holistic overview of what we've done is don't actually learn necessarily from previous papers. We're actually in a shifting world where what was done in the past was found to be lacking, and so basing modern papers or modern replication packages, etc., on what you see as the vast stock in that you can find on the internet is not necessarily the best way forward. I'm going to define computational empathy, and you should have that. One of the things that is generically lacking that people need to do is to track data. I'll explain that a bit. A bit of going back to basics to learn a bit more about the programming that we all do as empirical social scientists in our daily life, including some of the very basics that are actually in the instruction manuals for the languages that we write, whether that's Stata, Python, MATLAB, whatever. I suggest that one should learn to automate. It comes with various benefits, including the one that does it actually work if I run it all again, which is really nice. And then again, and this is hard, it's easy to say, preserve it all, version it all, but I'll get to where there's actually institutional support that would actually help a lot in getting researchers there, because not everybody can be a trained data archivist. Most of us are not. Thoughts for institutions. Institutions here, since I give this talk in a variety of contexts, departments, schools, library, research shops, IT sections within universities, things like that. is to offer training in adapted tools. Departments within universities should consider, in my opinion, whether or not some of this training should actually be integrated into the curriculum rather than having it be something that sits outside as a sort of add-on thing that you can do in your own time, etc. We're talking about the tools of the trade that we apply every day, and yet the training is often, not always, done as a sort of auxiliary thing outside of the core part. Institutions at universities, at departments, etc., can highlight appropriate locations, if not locally at a university. I'll point out some things, but what I mean by that in a sort of euphemistic way here is you don't have to provide everything yourself in today's world, but on the other hand, commercial sites can come and go, and so one needs to keep that in mind as well. So the right mix of, we provide this here within our institution, and here's this other thing outside that you can use, but it doesn't actually replace this thing. This sort of very informed way of guiding researchers to where the right tools are for the task is a very valuable tool. It also is highly discipline specific. It's not what works in biology or even what works in sociology will work in economics. So that is not a trivial task either. And then in some cases, it might be worthwhile to provide some more streamlined access that gives more control to, say, the university about, say, a commercial tool that you can subscribe to, or at least get some privileged access to, or additional compute hours or things like that. For faculty, one of the things that I'd like to point out is to encourage students to learn skills that faculty don't necessarily know. We like to have RAs that help us do our research, but we might also want to explicitly learn some of the new tricks from those RAs. And so there's this tension between, we're giving them new information, we're training them, but we can't train them on everything because we learned our stuff 20 years ago. And not all the tools of our trade have stayed constant since then. So this is a constant phenomenon I see in the articles, is that they're clearly driven by how people have done things in the past, and yet there are way better tools to do this with modern technology. And students are one way of sort of doing that. Of course, they need to get it somewhere, and this is where curriculum development and infrastructure at universities come into play. The other thing is to, and as I'll point out, reproducibility is important within the overall package of work that we ask the students to do, is to actually live it. So flippantly, don't ask them to email the latest version of the draft thesis. Ask them where it is in their reproducible GitHub repository and learn how to do that yourself. Right? So that's one way to incentivize reproducibility. And that is not easy. Okay, so where am I coming from? I already said I'm the data editor for the journals of the American Economic Association. Sorry, was there a comment? Okay, so I'm the data editor for these journals. That actually includes, some people might be surprised, Journal of Economic Literature and Journal of Economic Perspectives. But if you see a table, if you see a figure, it means that there was code behind it that was sourced from some data that came from somewhere. And so that is in scope for the purview that I have. What does our policy look like? What is sort of the driver of this? This is sort of the modern policy, and the key elements here are that we need to have transparency about where does the data come from, where does the code come from and live, and we require that much of that be as transparent as possible. So for instance, that data access be non-exclusive to the authors. It means that code needs to be accessible to everybody, so it can't be behind a paywall or require any undue sort of registration for things like that. We verify this policy prior to acceptance, final acceptance of the articles. Our articles are conditionally accepted based on their content, and then they are subject to a verification for compliance with this policy before the article is finally accepted and then can appear in the journals. Okay, and so what we're looking for is that there's enough information within those articles to permit replication. That's formulated in that convoluted way because not in all cases can we actually run the code, which is one trivial way of figuring out, is everything there and is it sufficient? But that's not the only way, right? And so we try out quite a few things there. There is a ton of guidance, and in particular, I do this with students, not graduate students, but actually undergraduate students, who should be able to read the instructions, follow the instructions, and re-execute those instructions to do so. So we train them on how should data provenance actually be. We train them on how can you do the inevitable debugging of Stata, MATLAB, etc. code. What are things you need to worry about, etc. And then they run this at scale. I'll point out I currently don't have enough of those students, so I'm a bit behind. If anybody has a current article under submission at the AEA, my apologies, we're caching them. The scale of what we're doing is on the order of about 500 articles a year. So over the time frame that we've done, we have completed about 1,000 papers. We've actually done far more. There's far more in the pipeline. The degree of inspection that we do, for instance, the papers and proceedings which come from the conference, they get a much lower level of inspection here. The fact that there are more assessments than articles is because some papers need to go through multiple rounds until they're at the stage where we find them acceptable. One of the things that helps us, and which might surprise other social scientists or even computer scientists, is that there's very little diversity in software. If you thought teaching the students how to do R and Python is going to help in subsequent publications in the AR, well, maybe in the future, but currently that's not what we see. So here's a somewhat old by now time trend of what it looks like. That little squiggly line way at the top, that's data. Right? That other squiggly line around the bottom is MATLAB. And in that morass of small lines at the bottom are things like Python and C and Fortran and R, etc. Are there trends in that? Well, if you squint, you might see some trends, but as a general phenomenon, not really. So that's a feature. It's actually an asset because it makes it somewhat simpler to train undergraduates on what kind of software they get comfortable running for others, because they're constantly running others' code. So it is what it is, right? I haven't defined what reproducible research in this context is. We're literally thinking here of re-execution of the code. We're not necessarily talking about, is this code correct? Is it going to be robust to feeding it newer data? What happens when no, not all of that is not there. We're talking about same material, same procedures, same data as provided by the authors, essentially the recipe, right? What is the computer code? What are the materials you put into it, including what are the same materials in terms of computers and time, and sometimes skill, okay? The inputs to the recipe in terms of data are well known, but it is as critical to understand that we also need to learn from the recipe what are the right computers. Are you going to make this recipe in a frying pan or a Dutch oven? Matters for the recipe, and if you're going to run this on a supercomputer or on a laptop, matters for economic research. Okay, so some observations here from those over 1,000 papers. It's obvious that most researchers don't actually rerun their code just before submitting. They've run code over the last year, 2, 5, whatever it is that it took to write the article, but they don't necessarily go back and run it, because we've clearly seen, and we regularly see this, again, it's a bit hard to get some statistics on this because it's a bit fuzzy to capture, but we clearly see code that as provided can't possibly have run. And that's a contributor to why when we then actually rerun it, we actually find discrepancies, okay? The other thing that researchers don't do enough is to streamline the process. And that's a corollary of not rerunning it, because if it were streamlined, it would be easier to rerun it. And the way I describe this in general is that it really is a penalty to, say, graduate students whom I've clearly seen, this was a graduate student paper, who had 100 variations of their model and all that was manually run. I really pity that poor graduate student, and it delays thesis, it delays research to not do this. Okay. And we see that most are not necessarily careful about documenting their data sources. I'll get to what we think is the right way to do it, and why that is a relatively novel process goes back to this idea of we're teaching what we learned, not necessarily what the newest technology on some of these things are, which are not core to, say, macroeconomics or labor economics or whatever. Okay. And finally, we do see a failure to curate their own data, and I'll get to that when I talk about institutional support. Okay, so some actual lessons. Computational empathy. I said I'd define that. Let me first say what it has as a background. There's this famous slogan popularized by Buckheit and Donahoe that the publication is merely advertising for the scholarship. You're actually describing, providing a summary of what's behind it. And if that is true, and if a scholarly article is us teaching somebody else about this new finding, teaching it means that we actually need to be better teachers of that. And what I consider to be computational empathy is put yourself into the position of the reader of the entire research compendium. Right, that includes the article, but it includes the code, it includes the data, etc. Can somebody else understand those instructions? That then begs the question, under what conditions do they understand those instructions? Right? What are the premises? What's the shared common knowledge that underlies that? I'm not going to have to re-explain how you open up a computer, but do I need to actually explain how I ran data code versus you ran data code? Right? What might they assume about the computing environment? The most frequent answer about discrepancies we found is, oh, but it ran fine on my computer. But your computer is clearly not the computer that somebody else is going to run it on in every single case that somebody will try and rerun it again. So how can you take that step back? That's what I call computational empathy. So one way to do that is to consider the potential readers. That might be as simple as, if there's any graduate students listening to this, you yourself in 4 years, right? You've graduated, you're somewhere else, you're prepping 2 new courses if you're lucky, but you have an R&R that's at a fantastic journal. The tenure decision will depend on it, but you also have a kid and a tenure decision coming up. Do you really have time to sort of figure out what you were thinking 4 years ago? Set the documentation now so that you understand that. A future RA, somebody who wasn't involved in the actual process. Your current RA explaining it to the next RA, because RA is transition between projects, right? And then what is a future reader going to think of? Right? So one way to think of it is pity the poor replicator. If you've got a dozen steps that need to be manually done through, and I've seen instructions that have like a 30-step process to download the data, do you really want to go through that again? Is that really the only way that you can think of doing that? If you think it's tedious and you'd like to make it better, think about the next replicator. Okay. So thinking about that tedious part, read the manual. Many of the things that we know could actually make things better are basics of software programming. They are things about setting working directories, how to record path names, how to leverage loops, how to create subroutines, how to pass parameters, right? We've seen programs that are like 10,000 line Fortran programs that are recompiled because it could have all been done by ingesting a parameters file, but in the end, there is 30 variations of it with one line somewhere in the middle of 10,000 lines of code changed to sort of do this. And I'm not joking. So thinking about some of these basics, what is the basics on how you can actually do some of these very simple things, is a time saver and makes everybody's life, including the future replicators' life, easier. The second observation is that social sciences love point-and-click interfaces, right? So I was just reading a README this morning that was prepared by the authors that went through and said, okay, you go to this website, you click on you scroll down to this other thing, and then you click on this and you save it. So that's a point-and-click interface, for which there is actually a really simple translation into scripts if you know how to do those scripts. But the thing that people see are the point-and-click interfaces. We see that most dominantly in social science papers for, say, maps. Just about four maps out of 5 are generated using something like ArcGIS or QGIS, etc., using interactive procedures. It's convenient to explore, but it's not necessarily reproducible, right? Data extraction tools. I'll give you here a few examples, and how to run software, right? So these are the result of, in part, a lack of computational, in part, a lack of knowledge, and lead to a high burden on reproducibility and replicability, but also to a high burden on the initial scientific process. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about a few solutions soon. Next part is data acumen. It's the ability to understand data, to make good judgments about and good decisions with data, and to use data analysis tools responsibly and effectively. That's sort of the National Academy's report. I boil it down to 2 things. Can you explain where you got the data from and why it's actually reasonable to use that data? And what you do with the data once you have it, right? So the whole idea about, is data actually appropriate? If I'm trying to convey that to others, you can't just say, Lars said. You have to actually say, where did you get it from? Did you do any manipulations along the way, etc. If I'm creating data, including the outputs from my research, how can I preserve that? Where can I put that, etc. And if you don't know what it means to say robustly preserve, you're not alone. And that's where I'll get to the institutional support. So data provenance, there's the idea of FAIR. People have heard about that. It's mostly about making data available to others. But if you are using data, then you're actually trying to experiment or actually experience what FAIR data means. So the give and take of accessing data is encoded in these principles. FAIR data principles rely a lot on metadata. So here's, for instance, the submission part of a particular data set that was deposited as part of what we see, right? So the more data you provide, the richer it becomes, the easier it becomes to be accessible, the easier it comes to be found. So the findable part is clearly there. Once it is saved, you sort of get information about these things. Here's metadata that says this is a spreadsheet. It's not just a bunch of bytes. Here's this metadata that says this is data. There's information on when these were created, about who created it. There's a title there, right? There's a citation, which means I can now cite it. If I reuse this data in something else, I can go back here and cite this. In this particular case, it's associated with a particular article. So that's also recorded here. That gives me additional information. And there's a whole ecosystem behind that that could work a lot better, but that's what it is. Behind the scenes, there's metadata like this, and that feeds into search engines like this. But this is the part that you're not going to make. This relies on institutions. It relies on somebody telling you where to properly archive it that generates this kind of information, and then making it accessible to others so that it becomes findable. Right? One way to convey this is through the data citation principles. Again, this is a relatively recent phenomenon that we have been using to some extent. This is the example from the AA style guide that has been out there for a decade and is rarely used to cite data this way. This is one way to identify that data provenance that leads back to the findable data through a URL in this case. Okay. In other cases, for instance, the Canadian Research Data Center Network, the Statistics Canada data that are accessible through that, a simple citation doesn't fully explain what are all the conditions to access it, which is also part of the FAIR criteria. So one needs a bit more about that. So one thing is that even this citation can be useful because now I know where the author got the data from. But we're not trained. I was not trained. Most of you probably were not trained to cite data. And yet it is relatively straightforward. If we were to cite a book, we know how to do that. Data citations aren't that different, right? And the typical answer I get for citing restricted access data of some kind, well, if I can't download it, I can't cite it, right? Which is fundamentally very wrong. Okay, so putting all those things together, let me come up with some suggestions, and then we'll see how far we get with that. Okay, so thinking about who that focal reader in the future is, how can we help you have better computational empathy is, okay, that next RA in 4 years or yourself in 4 years, you're going to hand them a document. We'll call that a README. You don't have time to explain it, so it needs to have all the details. What are sort of the minimal details that you want to have in there? It shouldn't take ages to understand what's going on there. So we've given you a template for that. That's not something that I came up with. It's a thing that we did jointly as a bunch of data editors, having had these kinds of insights and putting together a template README that has lots of different sections, which we find to be very useful when redoing that. Okay, so it has a DOI, so you can find it again. It has a website that goes along with it with some explanatory power. And if you are submitting to the AA journals, if you're submitting to the Canadian Journal of Economics, you have to use that because we're looking for all the information that's embedded in there. And if you don't provide it, we're going to get back to you and ask you, could you please provide that? Okay, so that handles some of the computational empathy part. How about the data provenance part? Well, it's actually not too complicated to do that. You keep all the information where you're at. You collect the data. There's a tier protocol that is targeted at undergraduates. We just talked about that at the last econ conference I was at. If you must use point-and-click interfaces, then you get to describe them. But if you find that tedious to describe every single step there, try and investigate if there are better ways of doing that. Try to use, for instance, an API. Okay. Caution, APIs are not a magic bullet. They might be convenient now, but they also come with problems in terms of they might also become obsolete, or they might go away. It's a web application. As many of these things, they might change over time. Okay. So to give you a few examples here, why use an API? I have to understand these things of URLs and postcodes and requests and whatever, all that kind of stuff. If I have this wonderful graphical interface, frequently used world development indicators, right? It has a wonderful interface. I need to define country, series, and time. That's part of what I need to describe in the README, and I can, right? I can list out all the countries. I can list out all the time series. Which GDP series do I want? Because there's many of them. But you can't just tell me use GDP. And what is the time frame? And IPAMS has a fabulous data extraction interface. Lots of people use it. It is a key part of what we're doing there. It's very well, lots of value added. It's extremely tedious to click through several hundred variables and click, choose them to sort of get an extract, right? Is there something better? Yeah, you could use, for instance, an API. You get to accessing data, for instance, on the world development indicators. You can use bulk downloads, but you can also sort of have a look at the API documentation. What does that look like? Well, there's a data package for that. I don't know if there's an R or Python package, but there's a data package for that. And that entire process of clicking through and doing stuff like that, it's one data line. That's a lot more convenient. And I might still need to say, I need to cite this data, right? So I still need to cite the world development indicators. But in terms of re-executing that, I've gone from several minutes to seconds, right? I just re-execute that, I'm done. IPAMS is also actually developing an API so that your extract that you might still need to declare in a sort of manual way, you've done it the first time around, but once you've done it, you can share that extract specification so that other people can download it. You can also share, of course, the IPAMS data that you downloaded, but I still need to know what is the data that you actually downloaded, how did you get there? So the specification is useful for that too. And in not all cases can you actually provide me with a copy of the data. Right? There's exceptions to that. You need to check the terms of use if you can do that. So that's part of the data tracking is check the terms of use. Observation number 4, academics don't actually check the terms of use because many of the data sets that you're trying to give me may not actually be legally redistributable. So check for that. As part of our data editor role, we actually question some of those practices. We question, are you allowed to give it or should you give it if the terms apply? And for instance, this site is one example of where we said, well, I'm not sure you can give us the data because there's actually copyright on that site. And we talked to the publishers. We do this with a lot of publishers, and they changed their policy to having a Creative Commons license on the site, which now says you are allowed to redistribute. That's what the terms of use now say. So now we're good, right? Now we can accept your data, and you get to say in the README, these data are made available under a Creative Commons license, right? So right to use data is you browse the website, you purchase the data, you sign a data use agreement, you got access to the data. And that might mean IRB approval and all those kinds of things as well. But that's distinct from the rights to distribute the data. Okay. So read the terms of use and adhere to them. Let me just skip through these. So that covers tracking data and provenance, another thing to keep track of. Now we're getting for coding suggestions. Again, pity the poor replicator. There's a few suggestions that we give that for some, we often get the response back, oh, but that's obvious. But you guys self-selected into this presentation, so you might have a bias towards already doing that. You'd be surprised how many people don't have a single or a very small number of master or main scripts, etc. Right? Least amount of manual effort is really what's there. We don't want in a replication package something that says change that parameter, run it again, save the graph, change the parameter back, do this other thing, save the graph, etc. Right? You want it to be efficient. Pity the poor replicator. Every single software package out there has the ability to save figures into PDF, PNG, EPS, whatever you want, right? And has the ability to save tables, CSV, LaTeX, Excel, whatever, right? All of them have it. There's not a single one that I've ever encountered that doesn't have it. And yet much of the code doesn't use that functionality, right? Oh, we copied this number and manually input it into an Excel spreadsheet, which then got stuck into the article, right? That's not very efficient, and it's not very reproducible, right? And packages. There shouldn't be any manual install of packages. Again, most people who work with R and Python do this more often, but they also don't always do it, especially if it's a social scientist learning this new tool called R and Python and stuff like that. This is just due to you're accreting packages over time on your computer. Which ones are you actually using? In some cases is visible. For instance, in R, you could have a library call so that you must have installed that package at some point in time, but which version do I actually have? Did I update it, etc.? That kind of stuff. In Stata, if it's installed, it's just usable. So there's no obvious way to actually go through a Stata program and see where these things are. But the replicator doesn't have your 3 years or 10 years of building up this library of packages on your computer. So how do you do that? Right? There's a script to do that. Even though there's nice point and click interfaces, that's, again, have a look back at what I said earlier about data acquisition. It's not particularly reproducible. Okay. And I already mentioned that you don't actually read the manual. Okay. Let me skip over these examples. And the key part when you're sort of writing code, especially if you're sort of thinking about data that is less accessible, right? All the things I said also apply if you are writing code that uses confidential data, because you can't assume that the replicators can't actually access the data. Somebody will. And so we ask for all code. There's no restricted access environment that I know of in the world that will prevent you from removing code from the confidential environment. Maybe modulo some redaction, but each one of them can have the code. You're going to provide the code, and somebody else is going to go and get the data, maybe already has access, and will second guess what's going on here. Okay? We do that as data editors. So we regularly get access to confidential data. We ran the pilot project in Montreal in July to sort of have replicators ex post, after publication of the article, get access to Statistics Canada data. We have worked before publication with French, Brazilian, and in some cases US confidential data, not the Census Bureau, but other confidential data. We've accessed commercial data that the authors can't redistribute, but they can give us a personal copy that we run with and then delete, right? And we know people that have access to the data. So for instance, when we get a paper with French data, we don't run it ourselves. We contact collaborators in Europe who have access there to the French data. And so never assume that nobody can run your confidential code. Somebody will, right? And we have one student coming from the summer workshop right now who's working through one of the Canadian Journal of Economics papers using the code and the data in the RDC. So code reproducibly and do so from the start. Okay. It's a lot of stuff to learn. And you're going to say, I want to focus on the economics of that. So I'm going to skip on some of the other things, like how to automate and preserve it all. But remember that you should probably learn about those two, because you want to focus on the economics. And that's, to some extent, where support by institutions then comes in. Okay. When do I think these tools should be taught? Right. If we're getting the answer that faculty weren't taught this, graduate students aren't learning it as part of what they're going through. They have a lot of stuff to learn. This is apparently not part of that. Some have it and some don't. But when should these skills be taught? I actually think that these are core tools of the trade, as I said, and they should be taught when we teach anybody how to do these kinds of things, which means at the undergraduate level. I'm working in my lab with undergraduates, so it's definitely a teachable skill on how to do these things. At the end of the year or 2 or 3 that they spend working in my lab, they actually come out occasionally quite jaded about the poor quality of the code that they do, because they've become efficient at doing these kinds of things. You don't need to work for my lab for 3 years to do that. These are things that can be taught relatively quickly. So these are core part of the graduate curriculum. And I like to make the analogy with biology, not just because I happen to have a daughter who's currently doing that, but where you learn skills such as how do you properly pipette? How do you tag field mice in the wild? Well, you don't learn that in the books. You actually go into the field, you capture a mouse and you tag the mouse, and then you recapture it 3 days later at 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that. So should we be teaching our students how to properly do this right from the start, when that's going to be a key part of every empirical social science we do? The answer, I think, is yes. It's not just learning how to code, it's also how to think about those data acumen skills, how to deposit data, how to set up a compute cluster if that becomes necessary, or whom to ask if you're going to set up a compute cluster. We can have a separate conversation about the fact that every university out there seems to have a compute cluster, and none of them are compatible with each other. So that's the least reproducible code that we get. Okay. Some of these skills fall squarely into some other categories, and we tend to think, yeah, we can delegate that out there, or we're going to ask them about that, right? But data librarians are typically understaffed, are not necessarily trained in discipline-specific practices. They also need to catch up on some of these things. Campus IT can help you. So, go talk to campus IT. But they're not necessarily meant to teach the next scientist on how to do this. And we have some common knowledge about how to do things, right? So these are things that might be improved to some extent by making it core to how we instruct it, and then it becomes a core part of the mission. Okay. This is slowly changing when we're talking about institutions, as say the funding institutions as well. Most grant funding doesn't actually value reproducibility. Maybe it values data repurposing or data publication. NSF is only now moving to this in the US. I know that the Tri-Council has open data mandates and stuff like that, but it's not clearly articulated what it applies to and all those kinds of things. So it's slowly coming there, but at least talking out of experience with my university, most universities still see this as an external mandate. If it's not funded by the granting agency, we're not doing it, right? So where does the money come from? Teaching is part of the key parts that is core to what we do as academic institutions, and that's where some of this might come from. Okay. And they need to consider some of the user experiences as well. So figuring out, teaching folks how to actually download using non-interactive means is not something I've seen most of the data use classes say in libraries as being the final step. It might not be the first step. It might not be pedagogically the right thing to do, but at some point you actually need to get there. Okay, now you've downloaded it this way. Now let's suppose you need to get 1,000 of these files. Are you still going to download them manually? No, here's this other thing that you could do, right? And of course, journals are important for this as well, because we're sort of at the end of that pipeline. We need to think of where we're going to grab this, how we define the standards, etc. I'll point out also that every journal that has sort of moved forward and is now offering, well, you have a replication package deposited at this repository. Most of those repositories are actually data repositories. Very few of them actually consider computation as part of the whole thing. I can point to a few, such as CodeOcean, a commercial company, and Wholetail, which is an NSF-funded part. There are a few smaller efforts around Dataverse, but they're only now emerging. So it's actually not easy to have a point-and-click reproducible archive in a very straightforward way. There are some more sophisticated integrations, which is where University IT, for instance, can help, that if I have data that's small enough or data that can be pre-archived or things like that, and I keep my code on something like GitLab or GitHub, etc., then there are things called, for instance, continuous integration that I can leverage to do some constant checking. What that means is I need to think about automation, I need to think about reproducibility and how to set those up. You can be a data geek like me, or you can have an IT stuff that actually does a lot of that work for you and gives you sort of a template on how to do that and then adjust it, right? Once set up, it's a huge time saver, but it takes some time to set up. It takes some time to grab. And that's where, again, institutional support to help with that is really important. Okay, so institutional support, my thoughts are here to offer training in some of the adapted tools, to highlight the appropriate community sites, Zenodo, Dataverse, the various things that tie these things together, the additional things to do that, and to provide maybe some streamlined access to some of the more frequently used open or commercial tools, such as running automated things in the cloud, etc. There are costs associated with this. There are training costs associated with this, and at least in my experience, IT groups are typically very helpful about these things, but they don't necessarily have in mind that somebody else at a very different university might want to do your replication package, and that's the translational part that we still need to do as scientists ourselves. Okay, and just to reiterate some of the thoughts for the role of faculty, and this is to encourage students to learn new skills. I'm an economist, so I'm going to say outside of economics, but outside of your own discipline, even if you don't have those skills, especially if you don't have those skills yourself. There's a lot that we can learn. I learned from my undergraduates. I teach them stuff that they didn't learn from other faculty. So there's a community about learning these kinds of things. And to focus not just, this is a cool tool, but also how does it fit within an academic streamline. That's where faculty have the information. So to make that translation from, here's a cool new dynamic document, yes, but how can we actually make that reproducible, and how can we make it work in the context of writing a scientific article? That's still an additional step. As I mentioned, demand reproducibility when reviewing. I mentioned continuous integration. When I'm looking at things, when I'm looking at sort of what we do with the lab, students might say, I have a problem with this. Here's the screenshot of what's happening. I say, I don't want that. We are versioning the code. I want to see what changes you made to the code and where the log file is exactly as you ran it. Point me to the repository. Once trained, it's a one-click link. I can literally go to lines 14,372 of a log file with one click, with the student saying, this is where I encounter the problem, right? And that, in the end, makes the debugging, it makes the tracing of these problems, etc., actually much easier. It has to be trained in, right? Those that are trained on this now just send us the link, and our conversations are much shorter about this kind of stuff. And let me just plug in here the replication challenges that we've also found. Reproducibility doesn't necessarily stop at submission to the journal. It can work afterwards. Abel Brodau is organizing a bunch of replication games. The next one, I think he just did Calgary. There's one up in Toronto in February. We're currently looking in, note to Magali, you'll hear from us on this. We're currently looking into doing this in Montreal in June. So we're doing these in various things. It's a very rewarding exercise to be able to have A, the satisfaction, hey, this actually works, and B, oh, this other thing doesn't actually work, and here's how one could make it work, and that starts a conversation, right? And finally, to then open up maybe the conversation, for the sake of the mental sanity and mental health of your students, don't produce irreproducible articles. There's at least one article that says that having to encounter irreproducible articles is a risk factor for poor mental health. It's in biomedical sciences, not in economics, so we're safe. Maybe not, I don't know. The role for journals in all of this, well, we're a reflection of our community, but we're also a very visible mass post on where to put forward standards, tools, and methods. I'm not going to put forward an AEA-specific tool. I coordinate with other data editors so that this becomes a reflection of what's feasible within our community, economics, but also what is acceptable across a wide range of journals. So my European colleague said we were going to create a guild. I said that's old-fashioned, so we have a more modern logo. But there's a bunch of social science data editors, and we cover things like the Economic Journal, Restud, the Canadian Journal of Economics, soon Econometrica, and a few other journals as well. Okay, and we've put together guidance both at the social science data editors, and I have some guidance on the data editor site for the AEA that's hopefully useful for guiding folks through this process, not just upon submission, but early on to sort of make the submission a lot easier. And with that, I'll stop and I'll leave up on the screen those reminders.
Thank you so much for an engaging talk. Any questions, comments, areas of discussion?
So Lars, we get to talk about these things a lot, but if just maybe while we wait for somebody else, what is your current thinking about how a confidential data custodian should deal with reproducibility attempts?
So my conversation at 8 o'clock this morning was with folks not at the German RDC, but at the institution behind that provides the data for that, not exactly the equivalent of StatCan. And we were talking about exactly this, is how far can an institution support this? How far can it be a hands-off exercise? I think some of it is just surfacing what the good practices that are already going on internally that have utility for the broader reproducibility, right? So are you backing up your data, right? Are you backing up or archiving, say, for 10 years? In our conversation this morning, and I know from the Census Bureau this is similar, said, yeah, of course we archive stuff. As soon as there's a request to do these kinds of things, it goes into a backup and it's available for 10 years. And I said, well, awesome. Write that up on a website, make it clear how somebody could actually request that, because that says all this stuff, no matter how badly or well it's documented, is available for 10 years from some point of time on, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the publication of the article, right? And how do I request that? How can I, as a future replicator, access the files that, say, Grant or you created within the RDC, right? So that then opens up the next conversation. The author needs to provide permission to use that kind of thing. Is that part of the submission? Is that part of how you actually exit things from the secure environment? Is that simply part of the environment? Is that you accept that others can access your files for a certain period of time, right? Those are policy things. They have nothing technological to do. They're just purely policy things, right? Should the data custodian then put in place a mechanism that streamlines some of this process, right? So the Germans have a policy that allows you to query whether or not it's credible that what was done was actually done. That policy does not allow you to do anything else with that. It just allows you to sort of get access to the same data, to the same code, and do exactly that analysis. Not a what if, no robustness checks, nothing. Just it was possible. Can you actually leverage such a policy? Is that actually a credible policy? Well, for that, we need replication games, because we need somebody to actually try those things out, right? And test them and do that kind of stuff. It's part of what the conversation this morning was about. I have similar conversation with the Census Bureau about, you have this policy. When we have something that can trigger that, can we actually get access to that? And then it becomes also a matter, and I've had this conversation with many researchers who face this, is the environment in which you are constrained actually conducive to doing all these best practices about versioning stuff. Even you don't need GitHub to version. You need some versioning tool internally that has an internal version that comes laden with all sorts of access things. Like if I put something there, can you on a different project see what I put there? No, that shouldn't be the case, but there are many ways to solve that. So is the computing environment, and you know, you and I have gone back on this a number of times, and Grant knows this ad nauseum, is the computing environment actually conducive to doing things a modern way, the way that people on the outside who are coming with the university training can do these kinds of things, right? And many of the environments that we are facing are not. I had a conversation with somebody who was using BLS data, which is now going to the NORC environment, and found it completely frustrating because the way it was set up actually prevents some of the best practices from happening. Should those be taken into account? Should one listen to that? There isn't just one best practice, but if no best practice is supported, that's a problem, right? So I think that's an ongoing conversation that just has to happen on a regular basis. And you know, are there workarounds that researchers can do to sort of still produce stuff that is reasonable? The first part is to understand that somebody else will get access to the same data, especially if it's in an RDC. That's the whole point of the RDC, is that it becomes available to others, right? And how do I convey what it is that I got? And here's my code. You can bring it back in and run it, and we feel that it's comfortable. Right? That's why I like the work that the student is doing as part of our summer replication challenges, because we actually took code from the journal back into the RDC, requested the same data, and are now running the analysis. He's running the analysis against the same data. And we said right from the start, we're not going to request output of a bunch of new tables. That's a burden on the agency. But if doing this at scale, how should Statistics Canada, for instance, think about what does a reproducibility check that somebody wants to run within the RDC produce as output? There should be some guidance about that to minimize, say, the disclosure risk. So those are just a few thoughts about that part.
Great.
I started having that conversation
All right.
5 years ago, but I'm glad that we're having it too. So about reproducibility contracts within the RDC. So glad that's on your agenda too.
I have a question about, you had mentioned that sometimes code will run or not run or run differently on different computer environments. So supercomputers versus laptops. That's the first time I heard that. Can you expand more on, is it particular software? Is it all software? Yeah,
So,
that's entirely new to me.
So the first part was to even know if it actually has to run on a supercomputer on a laptop, right? So it is one of our most frequently requested updates to the README is, please tell us, is this something that runs on a supercomputer in 3 months or something that runs on a laptop in 5 minutes? Because this is a simulation. I have no idea if doing some bootstrapping in the background or not, right? That is in and of itself a challenge for many researchers who got awesome IT support, and the IT support didn't actually explain to them what they were actually using because it's all free within the university or something like that, right? So I've had researchers say, yeah, I used our university supercomputer cluster because it has 1,000 nodes with 15,000 cores and an aggregate of, you know, what they put on their website about being very proud this is a big cluster. And you look at the code, and it's our code that just requires 64 gigabyte of memory in one thread. You're not using the supercomputer cluster, but you are using something that is bigger than a laptop. And so those requirements, again, it's hard to figure out, even in the best of cases, what are you actually using? What is the minimum necessary, unless you do some very time consuming and mostly unnecessary tests. But to even be aware of what it is that you're trying to do is very important, right? Most social science research is not big computing. Then the second part is, do things actually run differently? And there, again, there's the trivial parts where most software is pretty good these days so that you can run in any environment and produces similar results. You can run data code very reliably on Mac, on Windows, on Linux, and it mostly produces the same code 99.99% of the time. Right? There are some subtleties that where it does matter if you're running, say, a multi-threaded version of the software versus a single-threaded version of the software. And there are some subtleties where we've seen minor differences, 7th, 8th digit, when running something on a Mac versus a Linux system, etc. Mostly those don't matter, right? If they do matter, it's probably because that part of the analysis isn't robust in and of itself, right? We've had cases where, say, they try to impute some numbers by cell, and some of those cells become really small and they break. The README will say you'll have to tune this. What does tuning mean? Do you write code that's robust to those failures, that captures the output from that, etc.? See, or does tuning mean you're going to generate 1,000 versions of that code and you're going to delete the ones that don't work because you've observed that, right? The trouble with that, as it turns out, is that when I request data that is subtly different, it's going to be a different cell that fails. So again, this goes back at the computation part. And part of that has to do with, say, am I multiprocessing? Am I on a fast computer? We're mostly beyond the point where running something faster all of a sudden breaks something because the code was meant to be run slower or things like that. But occasionally we find those problems as well. They're minor things, right? They rarely do stuff that sort of gets there. But it's important to understand when it does, because randomness, for instance, if you're going multi-threaded, you can fix the seed, but as soon as you go multi-threaded, it matters whether you go 5 times, 15 times, 50 times, because you're starting from the same part, but you're a different part of the chain. And if that matters, for instance, for sample selection, which it sometimes does, you get different sample numbers that ultimately change some of the output in a maybe more observable way. Should you be aware that that might happen? Yes. Are most social scientists, even most computer science students or something like that, aware that that does happen when you don't actually modulate the number of cores that you're running on or things like that? Absolutely not, right? So it's one of those things that we discover that the author could not really be faulted for not finding, because it's expensive in time to go through all possible iterations every time.
Thank you. This was incredibly helpful. All right, we are at time. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Lars, for presenting this